Welcome to the Decrepit mansion at Moonlit Manor. As you wander through the mansion, feel free to explore at your own speed. Take as many pictures as you want, but please don't touch anything. The ghosts here are very mean. In the somewhat unlikely event that one of you gets lost or killed in the Decrepit mansion, you hereby declare that your ghost will not return to haunt other visitors. The mansion is haunted enough as it is. Above the fireplace hangs a portrait of the Malburn family, who moved here from Chicago in 1871. When the neighbors found out that the Melbournes were moving into the Decrepit mansion, they warned the Melbournes that the mansion was haunted, but Mr. and Mrs. Melbourne didn't believe in ghosts, so they moved their 8 children into the mansion anyway. Now the Melbournes lived in the mansion peacefully for 4 months until things started to get a little bit strange. The portrait above the fireplace is of the Melbournes when they first moved here. Unfortunately, they were never that happy again. On August 1871, just 4 months after moving into the mansion, 10-year-old Henry Malburn was eating his dinner with his family when he started gasping and foaming at the mouth. His seizures lasted 28 torturous minutes before his body lay quiet on the ground. Back in the 1800s, they did not have good medicine like we do now. When someone got sick, they had to rely on home remedies to try to heal the afflicted. Mrs. Malburn was a world-renowned apothecary with a large collection of rare and expensive ingredients for her concoctions. Several of her ingredients are still here, more than 200 years later. Look closely and you can see hemlock and saltpeter, and even laudanum. After little Henry died, Mrs. Melbourne was never the same after that. Although no one knows for sure how it happened, Mrs. Melbourne blamed herself for little Henry's death. She surmised that she had mistakenly used one of her more deadly remedies instead of one of the spices that was called for in her dinner recipe. After that unfortunate night, Mrs. Melbourne's health began to decline. She started staying in her bedroom. She refused to join the rest of the family for meals. She lost weight. Her face became pale and sunken. She stopped smiling. By November, Mrs. Melbourne didn't have the strength to get out of bed. And on December 24th, the day before Christmas, Mrs. Melbourne passed away in her sleep at the age of 38. This was 8-year-old Alice Melbourne's bedroom. Alice was sweeter than an angel. She loved to read and play with her dolls, but most of all, she loved to play dress-up. After Mrs. Melbourne passed away, little Alice would sometimes sneak into her father's room and try on her mother's dresses. She would stand in front of her mirror and twirl and twirl. But one day that all came to an end when an explosion from William's bedroom ripped through the wall and enveloped poor little Alice in flames.
From that day on, every October, the tortured ghost of Alice Malburn returns to haunt the mansion she once called home. They say, if you look closely, you can sometimes see Alice's ghost staring back at you from within her mirror.
This bedroom once belonged to 16-year-old William Malburn. William was a scientist at heart, and his passion was chemistry. Day after day, month after month, he worked and worked to discover an elixir that could bring his late mother back to life. After his mother's passing, William was a troubled young man. He frequently burst out in fits of rage at even the slightest misfortunes. Some say you can see the devil in his eyes. And then one of his experiments backfired, killing his sister Alice. William ran away from home never to return. Some claim that he succeeded with his experiments and discovered the elixir of life, that William is still alive, out there somewhere, trapped as a 16-year-old for more than 200 years, and still as tortured as the day he ran away. After the death of his wife and 2 kids, Mr. Melbourne dedicated himself exclusively to his work. Mr. Melbourne was an expert clockmaker. This was his workshop where he repaired clocks from around the world. But no matter how hard he tried, Mr. Melbourne could not erase his family's misfortunes from his memory. He tried to find love in his work, but the harder he tried, the more depressed he became. Eventually, Mr. Melbourne could not bear the sight of his surviving children because they reminded him too much of his deceased wife. Psychologists today would probably diagnose Mr. Melbourne with psychotic depression, but perhaps his psychotic delusions were not delusions after all. This is the lab where Edward, the oldest child, spent most of his time. You see, Edward was fascinated with electricity. In an age where candles were used for light and fire were used for heat, electricity was almost like magic. The sheer power of electricity was unimaginable, and Edward was captivated by its possibilities. Unfortunately, Edward was not invincible to its powers. Exactly 1 year after 10-year-old Henry's death, Edward electrocuted himself and burned himself to a crisp. Welcome to the library. This was 13-year-old Florence Melbourne's favorite room. She wanted nothing more than to curl up on the couch with a good book. She loved reading so much that she often forgot to do her chores or even eat dinner. On June 14, 1872, Florence met her demise when a bookcase tipped over on top of her and squished her flat. Since then, Florence's ghost has never left this library. Sometimes she's peacefully reading on the couch, but other times she's agitated and moves the books around, looking for a way to escape. This is the body of Mr. Melbourne, who eventually hanged himself because of the terrible misfortunes that befell his family. After Mr. Melbourne died, some kind neighbors took the 2 surviving children in to live with them. Now that you've seen the Decrepit mansion, what do you believe? Were the Melbournes just victims of terrible misfortune, or is the mansion really haunted? Welcome to the Decrepit mansion at